Steal away, steal away, steal away to Jesus. Steal away home. I ain't got long to stay here.
In many cases, tobacco plantation owners and their sons worked the fields along with their slaves. Henry Bruce Clay wrote of his master's son being one of his playmates as a child. Slaves on tobacco plantations tended to be owned and worked in small groups and were also able to develop family systems. The other major North American destination for African slaves, beginning in the late 1690s, was South Carolina. There, African slaves were put to work in the rice fields. The difference between Virginia and South Carolina for the life of the slave began at the point of sale. Because the Chesapeake region did not have a central port, slavers would travel up and down the river system, selling slaves to merchants at various stops. Those merchants would then march the slaves around the region, selling them a few, or sometimes just one at a time. In South Carolina, the Africans were all brought to Charleston, where they were sold in large lots to rice planters who would travel to the city for the sole purpose of attending the slave auction. Rice planters learned to value slaves from the rice-growing regions of West Africa, as these slaves arrived with more knowledge of rice cultivation than that of the planters themselves. Most of the early English settlers in Carolina had come from Barbados, where they had owned sugar plantations. They initially brought slaves with them, and in fact received more land if they brought more slaves. Planters would continue to receive additional land for each slave brought to the colony, and this, plus the need for labor and the benefits provided by the West Africans, encouraged the planters to continue importing slaves. Unlike the Virginia Society, Carolinian slave owners had no history of indentured servants. Whereas Virginia's first exposure to slaves was one in which they worked similar jobs to white servants, South Carolina's experience began with slaves in the rice fields. Slavery in South Carolina, perhaps as a consequence, looked more like slavery in the West Indies than in Virginia. The heat and intensity of rice cultivation was also much harsher than found in the tobacco fields of Virginia. As a Charleston merchant, Samuel Everly stated,
I am positive that the commodity can't be produced by white people because the work is too laborious, the heat very intense, and the whites can't work in the wet at that season as Negroes do.
Rice cultivation was certainly grueling work. After the first few decades of cultivation, in which fields were rain-fed and rotated between use for rice and use for manure-producing cattle, plantations moved to the inland swamps and tidal marshes. This shift required significant labor, transforming the land to enhance irrigation, prevent saltwater encroachment, and allow sufficient drainage. Slaves constructed earthen dikes to surround each field. These dikes, which they called banks, were as tall as a man and up to 15 feet wide. One archaeological historian has estimated that by 1850, the amount of earth moved to construct the banks and canals for the rice fields of Carolina and Georgia was almost 3 times the volume of the world's largest pyramid. And it was all completed by African slaves using simple hand tools and back-breaking effort. But the expertise and labor brought by the West African slaves and the suitability of the climate to rice cultivation led to an explosion of production. In 1698, South Carolina plantations produced 5 tons of rice for export. Just 2 years later, they produced 330 tons. That reached 5,000 tons per year by 1730 and 25,000 tons by 1740. Another major difference between Virginia and South Carolina was the source of their slaves. Initially, of course, both colonies received their slaves from Africa, or elsewhere from Caribbean plantation owners whose own source had been Africa. But by the 1720s, Virginia's slave population was self-sustaining. Because Virginia slave owners had purchased African women as well as men, the slaves were themselves generating new generations of human property. In contrast, South Carolina planters purchased male Africans almost exclusively. To replenish and grow their stock of slaves, South Carolina planters continued to make large purchases of slaves up until the end of the international slave trade in 1807. Of course, slavery was not confined to Virginia and South Carolina. In fact, slaves were held in bondage in every single British colony in North America. However, slavery was much less common north of Virginia and Maryland. The cooler climate made the northern colonies more welcoming to European indentured servants, so they were a plentiful labor source. Also, the economy in the North was more diversified, lacking any profitable staple cash crop. In addition, settlers in Pennsylvania and New England had left their homes in a desire to practice their utopian religions without persecution. This is in contrast to settlers in other North American colonies, or throughout the New World, who left their homes to seek their fortunes. In fact, Quakers in Pennsylvania were among the only outspoken critics of the slave trade in the 17th century. They called on their fellow citizens, including those Quakers who did own slaves, to improve the conditions of slaves, educate them in Christianity as well as reading and writing, and work toward emancipating them. Nonetheless, slavery did exist in the northern as well as southern colonies. Maryland began using slaves in the 1630s and wrote it into law in the 1660s. African slaves worked in Maryland's tobacco production, much as Virginians did. Georgia initially had an anti-slavery law, but by 1750 slavery had been legalized and Georgia had entered into rice production, like South Carolina. In North Carolina, during the early colonial period, slaves could primarily be found in Wilmington, as its port was easily accessible to slave traders. The New England colonies had relatively few slaves, but they were at the center of the North American slave trade. Massachusetts built the first American slave ship in 1636 and largely controlled the slave trade in New England. Rhode Island was a major producer of rum as part of the trade triangle of molasses, rum, and slaves. The colony would sponsor almost 1,000 slaving voyages to Africa before the international slave trade was outlawed in 1807. New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania were under Dutch rule until taken by the British in 1664. The Dutch had encouraged the slave trade, and the British did nothing to change this. Of course, slavery, and the majority of the new American slave population, was heavily concentrated in the southern colonies. That fact would continue throughout the colonial period and would lead to the struggles that eventually sparked the Civil War. Along the way, the lives of slaves in general would become harsher. Tensions would rise as voices in opposition could finally be heard. The abolitionist movement would encourage the spread of liberty and would lead to terrible violence in liberty's name. Such was the long, hard path up from slavery.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.